Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, the Abattoir of Zir was released a few days ago, and put simply, it defied our expectations a bit in a few different ways. One of them is the difficulty. The developers did say that this activity would be difficult, and they also promised that the difference between each tier of the Abattoir would be much greater than the difference between each tier of Nightmare Dungeons, and that has absolutely turned out to be true, as you can actively feel the difference between each Abattoir tier, and you can really tell that the enemies are notably stronger than the tier even the one right before it. The other surprise was to do with the unique Glyph reward from this event, which gives you a multiplicative damage bonus increase depending on these core stats that you have purchased and its radius. And the general belief of the community before this happened was that the Glyph would be affected by only your main stat, such as only strength for Barbarians. It would be class specific. But the second we actually got our hands on the Glyph ourselves, we realized that was definitely not the case, and in fact the damage bonus from the Glyph is in fact boosted by every single one of the stat nodes that are in its radius. And so of course this sort of changed the whole concept of where we want to slot it into our boards and how to build around it. So today we're going to go over the Barbarian build that I brought into Abattoir of Zir and how it changed and improved the more of this activity that I did, along with the most efficient placement and most effective usage of the Tears of Blood Glyph in this setup as well. And it's worth noting that specifically the Hammer of the Ancients build on Barbarian as of right now seems to have the highest possible power cap for this activity of anything in the game, assuming that of course you have all the relevant uber uniques and you level up your Tears of Blood Glyph as much as physically possible. But even without those two things, this is just unnaturally good for this activity. Barbarian is unnaturally good for this activity, so we'll go over our skill points in the build and where we've chosen to use them, our technique slot of course, our legendaries and uniques, as well as any uber uniques that you should slot in if you happen to have access to them, your general affixes and stats goals on your more normal gear, our vampiric powers of choice too, then our Paragon board setup, followed by any tips that I have for playing this build, especially in the context of Abattoir of Zir itself. Starting off with the skill points then, for your basic skill we are taking Lunging Strike, as well as its enhancement and also Combat Lunging Strike. Altogether this gives you a basic skill with good forward momentum that also does bonus damage and heals you when it hits a healthy enemy. Also it gives you Berserking for 1.5 seconds when you crit with it. After that we move on to the core skill node cluster, and of course we're going to be taking Hammer of the Ancients, just every rank that you can physically fit into it, because this is our main damage ability, so quite simply the more the better. Then we're also going to be taking the enhancement for a boost to Fury generation after hitting enemies with the skill, and also Furious Hammer of the Ancients for a damage increase to the skill by 1% for each point of Fury that you have when you cast it, giving us damage increase from bonus maximum Fury affixes. Then we move directly onto the next cluster and take our first couple of shouts, starting with Rallying Cry as well as its enhancement and also Tactical Rallying Cry, altogether giving you a chunk of resource, a big chunk of bonus resource generation while active too, and also a little bit of movement speed bonus as well. Then we're going to be grabbing Challenging Shout, its enhancement, and also Tactical Challenging Shout. Altogether, this is your big damage reduction cooldown, taunting nearby enemies, giving you a ton of just base damage reduction as a stat, a good chunk of bonus maximum life, and then also just increased Fury generation when you are hit by an enemy. Then we're also going to be grabbing some passives here, 3 ranks of the Imposing Presence passive for a good chunk of permanent massive bonus health, 3 ranks of Martial Vigor as well for 12% damage reduction from elites, and then 1 rank of Outburst, mostly just as a gateway for 1 rank of Tough as Nails. This gives you bonus Thorns percentage, which is sort of irrelevant. The main part of this though is that the Thorn damage that you deal to enemies will then cause them to bleed, and this way we can activate our various bleed bonuses, our bonuses against bleeding enemies, when they hit us. So we don't even have to hit them first to activate them. This helps a lot defensively, interestingly enough, and also opens up our technique slot. After that we move on to the next cluster and grab our final shout, which is going to be Warcry, as well as its enhancement, and then also Power Warcry. Altogether this creates a damage boosting shout that also gives you 4 seconds of Berserking. It also gives you an even larger damage boost if you have enough nearby enemies when you cast it. Then we just grab a ton of passives in here, 3 ranks of Booming Voice for increased duration on all of our shouts, as well as 3 ranks of Guttural Yell, which causes nearby enemies when you use your shouts to just do significantly reduced damage for a few seconds afterwards. Then we're going to be grabbing 3 ranks of Aggressive Resistance over here, which boosts your damage reduction while berserking, and I've just got a few extra ranks from my gear itself, and then there's of course 3 ranks of Prolific Fury for just even more Fury generation while you are berserking. After that we head to our next cluster where we're going to be looking for even more passives, 3 ranks of Pit Fighter right here for bonus damage against close enemies and extra damage reduction from distant enemies, 1 rank of Thick Skin, but this is mostly just a gateway to 3 ranks of Defensive Stance for bonus damage reduction while fortified, as well as 2 ranks of Counter Offensive for bonus damage while you have more than half of your life fortified. After that we move over and we're going to be grabbing Wrath of the Berserker and its enhancements, and this is our ultimate skill, giving you a hefty damage cooldown that gives you Berserking and lets you reapply it anytime you use a basic skill in the duration, knocking back nearby enemies and making you unstoppable as well. You also get bonus movement speed and fury generation, and you get an increased berserk damage bonus for spending fury while under the effect as well. Then we just grab some passives around here to round it all off. 3 ranks of Wallop over here for bonus damage against stunned and vulnerable enemies with bludgeoning weapons, then 3 ranks of Brute Force here for a large multiplicative increase to our overpowered damage when using a two-handed weapon, which of course we do all the time. Then our final point is going to be in our key passive, which is of course going to be Unbridled Rage, as you might expect, increasing your fury cost on core skills by quite a lot, but also increasing their damage by an even larger amount. And this extra damage scales with our bonus damage per fury enhancement on Hammer of the Ancients, so really it just creates a lovely synergy within the build anyways. With that covered then, let's talk about our technique slot. The majority of our damage within this build comes from Hammer of the Ancients, which is forced to use our two-handed mace expertise. It's just the way it works. Now that we have bleed application from our thorns themselves through our passive skills, we no longer need to actually use the two-handed sword technique, and instead we'll be using the two-handed axe technique for a 15% damage increase multiplier against vulnerable enemies just consistently. With that then, let's talk about our legendaries and uniques, as well as any uber uniques that do work in this. And this is where it's going to get a bit more complicated due to Abattoir of Zir and its difficulty scaling. In lower tiers, pure damage is more important. As you progress through them though, tankiness will become more important, but also your damage still is very much a thing that matters due to the timer on the activity. So there are some things to swap around depending on how deep you get. The standard template though is as follows. Banished Lord's Talisman for your amulet is the most important unique of the build. This gives you a massive multiplier bonus anytime you have an attack that both overpowers and crits at the same time, as well as giving you a relatively reliable, frequently activated, guaranteed overpower to work around this with as well. The affixes on it are all incredible for our build. Then on one of our ring slots we have the Ring of Red Fur, which essentially just makes every other Hammer of the Ancients cast a guaranteed crit, which of course works great with the amulet itself, but then it also boosts the damage of those crits happening too. On top of that, it has high resource generation and a high maximum fury bonus affix, so it has even greater value still. Then we also have Tybalt's Will as our pants slot here, and this provides you bonus maximum fury, some close enemy damage reduction, and up to 40% bonus damage while unstoppable and for a few seconds after being unstoppable as well, which of course has near permanent uptime due to our shouts and how they work. Finally, for our uniques, in the helmet slot we have the Tusk Helm of Yoritz the Mighty for its bonus effects while berserking, and just generally solid affixes in general too, boosting both your offense and your defense. Here comes the fun part though. If you have Shaco, the Harlequin Crest Uber unique, you slot that in instantly. It just becomes your helmet. In that situation where you have that Uber unique, because of its raising slot ranks, giving you cooldown reduction and also resource cost reduction too, you can actually make a larger change to the build where you drop your basic skill entirely and instead use something like Ground Stomp as a final skill for an AoE on-demand stun that will also reduce the cooldown of your ultimate ability. But in order to have your resources work functionally without any basic skill, you do pretty much need Shaco to have that work. As well, if you have them, you should also use the Grandfather Sword without a doubt, same with Doombringer as a one-handed weapon. These don't create any notable skill point swaps or anything like that, they're just stupidly strong as is. Then the final uber unique of note is actually the Melted Heart of Selig, which will come into play on and off as you push the limit of your ability by pushing the highest tier of Abattoir that you can. This amulet makes you insanely tankier than Banished Lords does. It makes you near immortal, honestly, in the majority of the tiers of Abattoir of Zir, but the damage loss of putting it on is absolutely major. So essentially this is if you get into a situation where damage intake is a big problem and you've tried every other method of reducing it, that's when we make this swap. Otherwise, losing Banished Lord's Talisman is too much of a loss. As well, it's worth noting that you can actually swap between these mid-run of a tier of Abattoir of Zir, of course. If you think that you're going to take a lot less damage from the general trash than you are from the Bloodseekers, you can run Banished Lords on the trash and then switch to Selig for the Bloodseekers themselves. Stuff like that. You just change back and forth based on what is needed, and you don't even need to wait in between runs. It can be an on-the-fly decision. On that note, the first change you will make in a more permanent manner if you are having major damage intake issues is taking off Tybalt's Will themselves and instead replacing them with actual defensive pants like these. Notice my armor jumping up significantly as the first thing, but just look at the beauty that this has, and it has the actual Iron Blood aspect on it, which is what I'd recommend replacing Tybalt's Will with if you have to make this kind of swap. Doing this gives you a ton of bonus damage reduction that Tybalt's Will does not give you, but of course this comes at the cost of at least 40% multiplicative damage from the actual effect of Tybalt's Will themselves. So again, this is a pretty major swap, but it is much less than if you were to lose Banished Lord's Talisman. Banished Lord's Talisman is just much bigger for this build. As for other gear then, we have the Limitless Rage aspect on our two-handed bludgeoning weapon for bonus damage for every fury that you generate above the maximum on your next core skill. Edge Master is going to be on your two-handed sword slot for bonus damage, depending on how much resource that you have, and if you have the Grandfather Sword as well, you want to move this bonus to your gloves instead. Then we have have the two one-handed weapons that are Ancestral Force over here for an increased circular splash radius on Hammer of the Ancients, which is the big part of the radius increase here, and then the Earthstriker aspect over here for a guaranteed overpower when you switch your weapons a few times back and forth. We activate this by having Lunging Strike set to use our slashing weapon, so we swap back and forth quite naturally as a result. That said, if you have Doombringer, this is the aspect to replace. Then we have the Bold Chieftain's aspect on our remaining ring slot, which constantly reduces your shout cooldowns by quite a noticeable amount, which is a really big deal as we are without a doubt at our strongest when our shouts are active. More frequent shouts means more frequent strength, more power, and yes, while this does have a bit of a lower peak than some other ring options, it stabilizes your actual output and also increases your consistency, while also giving you more frequent access to challenging shout, which is your massive damage reduction cooldown as well. Then on our gloves, we have the Relentless Berserker aspect for a chance to increase our berserking duration when using core skills. Then our defensive slot up here is going to be Disobedience, of course, helping us reach that 14k armor requirement to be damage reduction capped in Abattoir of Zir. Then on our boots, we have the Ghostwalker aspect, which lets us walk through enemies and gain movement speed bonuses when unstoppable, and also for 4 seconds afterwards as well. This is just a major defensive boon specifically for avoidable damage, telegraphed attacks, and it just lets you avoid them much easier when you can actually walk through things. That covers our legendaries then, and uniques, as well as any relevant ubers and any swaps that you need to be aware of for dealing with different levels of difficulty of the Abattoir of Zir. So what about your affixes and stats on gear, which of course matter more here than anywhere else? Well, offensively, you want to get as many bonus ranks to Hammer of the Ancients as you can, of course. You want crit chance, you want overpower damage, attack speed is really nice, resource generation, cooldown reduction, all of those things are super important offensively for the build. Defensively, you want to make sure that you take care of your resistances. Barb is generally able to do that with just having a couple of solid resistance rolls on your boots, then the rest can be filled in with Paragon and gem slots on your jewelry just to make sure that you hit maximum resistance on all 5. Then you just want total armor percentage, at least 1 roll. 2 if you take off Tibalts and use normal pants instead. You want damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distance, general damage reduction just as a whole, damage reduction while fortified, maximum life increases, all those kinds of buffs to our survivability. With that covered then, let's talk about our Vampiric Powers for the build, for which of course we are leaning a bit more defensive than normal. Starting off, we have a classic but very important combo. Accursed Touch gives you a lucky hit chance to apply Vampiric Curse to enemies, as well as increasing the damage of the souls from this mechanic too. Then we have Prey on the Weak for bonus vulnerable damage. The tooltip is incorrect, and it seems that this is actually an additive bonus, which does make it less valuable, but our main reason for using this is the second part of it. Enemies affected by Vampiric Curse count as vulnerable. We use this as our main vulnerable application method, and so it is a multiplicative damage boost for us because of that. Then we have Blood Boil for a guaranteed overpower once every 20 seconds, which is fantastic, as well as the little globules that you can walk over for pops of bonus damage too. After that is Undying, just a bit of tankiness on smaller hits, healing for 3% maximum life whenever you cast any skill, and this is quite a lot for our survivability on the smaller actually incoming damage, not for one-shots obviously, but it helps your just general survivability. Then we also have Resilience in our last slot, which gives us scaling damage reduction the lower our health gets, and actually this gets extremely strong when you get to really low health numbers, which is why on occasion you might see me just hit basically no health, but then hover at that 1k mark, just taking essentially 0 damage for a bit. This makes you pretty much immune with Barbarian to anything that isn't one-shot level, honestly. With that then, let's dive into our Paragon board setup. On the starting board, you want to head up the left side through the defensive rare node up to the Glyph socket, in which you want to stick in the Crusher Glyph for bonus damage with bludgeoning weapons, as well as a secondary effect of a large multiplicative bonus on our overpower damage. Then you want to grab the rare nodes and required strength in the area before exiting out of the top side of the board and attaching on the Bonebreaker board with the legendary node in the bottom left side. You want to head directly to this legendary node, grabbing the damage reduction while fortified nodes that are along the way too, and the effect itself is just a bonus guaranteed overpower once every 12 seconds. Simple, but very good for our build. After that, you want to head back to the start of the board and then go up the right side this time through the defensive rare node and up to the Glyph socket itself to stick in the Ire Glyph here for bonus damage while berserking, which is really good for us, as well as reduced damage from elites while you are berserking too. Then we grab the rare and relevant magic notes in the area, as well as the strength required to activate the glyph before heading out the right side of the board and attaching on the Carnage board with the legendary node on the right side. You want to head immediately right and down, and here you see the just absolute mess that is the Tears of Blood glyph in this socket. This glyph scales a multiplicative damage boost for every 5 of any core stat that is purchased in the radius, as well as boosting the effectiveness of any rare node in the radius as well. This makes it here an optimal position for us on this board, as this has the most literal just nodes within the radius that you could pick up, as well as our strongest offensive rare node in damage while berserking and a solid defensive one too in damage reduction from close enemies. We grab literally every single node within the radius of this for the maximum damage boost that it can give you. Then we take the damage while berserking rare and magic nodes in the top left as well, before we want to exit out of the bottom side of the board, where we're going to be attaching on the Warbringer board with the legendary node and glyph socket in the top right side. After that, we want to head to the left side here through the maximum fury increase rare node and magic nodes as well, and wrap around to the legendary power itself, which gives you a bunch of maximum life as fortify when you spend a certain amount of fury. You don't have to spend a lot of fury in this build to actually get a long way, which means that you get a lot of fortify as a result from this node, and this is basically just our main fortify generation. After that, you want to wrap down to actually grab the fire resistance rare magic nodes here. This just fills the one hole in our resistances that we have that we don't fill with jewelry and such, so this is actually really solid. If your resistance is, say, lacking cold resistance instead of fire resistance, you can instead grab this one up here in the same amount of points pretty much. It's basically just a swap depending on where your resistance hole is, which depends what you have rolled on your boots. After that, you want to go back up to the top of the board and wrap around to get to the glyph socket itself, inside of which we are putting our Wrath glyph, which boosts our critical damage by quite a fair amount and also gives us a bonus effect that gives you 3 fury every time you get a critical hit, which does stack when you hit multiple enemies and is affected by our resource generation stat as well for a lot of bonus regen. And again, we are just grabbing all the relevant rare magic nodes as well that are nearby, and just a bit more than the required amount of dexterity in the radius 2 before we head out of the right side of the board to stick on the Blood Rage board with the legendary node in the bottom left corner. After that, you want to head pretty much directly over there, while stopping to, of course, grab the damage while berserking bonus nodes on the way over, which are just really important for us. Then once you have the legendary node itself, the effect will be killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to give you berserking for 5 seconds, but significantly more importantly than that, this gives you a permanent secondary multiplicative damage bonus equal to 25% of your damage while berserking stat. This lets you double up a lot on the damage that we gain from that stat, and then from here we want to go back to the Carnage board and just wrap around the right side through yet another damage while berserking rare and magic node cluster to head out the right side of the board and attach the Decimator board here with the legendary node on the left side so we can just get to it as quickly as possible using the exact amount of points that we have remaining. Doing that, you will get the node itself, which gives you a 10% increased multiplicative damage bonus when you make an enemy vulnerable, as well as a second 10% multiplicative bonus for overpowering a vulnerable enemy. That's all your Paragon points. We use it on a bunch of glyphs. We got a bunch of nodes. We even filled out our Tears of Blood absolutely entirely, so this can't physically give us more than it is right now unless you level it up, of course. And, well, I'm just really happy with this board. It really does everything that we want it to. It accomplishes all of our goals, and it incorporates a lot of both damage reduction and offensive increases. So that does it as far as putting the build together then. So how about any actual gameplay tips? Well, a big part of this is to be able to properly judge when you need to make the equipment swaps that I talked about earlier. If you reach the point where you decide to swap Selig on, it probably means that you've hit a nasty wall, as swapping Banished Lords for Selig does increase your tankiness an insane amount, but it lowers your peak and consistent damage by quite a large amount, making it harder to actually reach the timer of the event itself. The best advice that I can give you is to play it carefully. Avoid engaging large packs of difficult enemies unless your shouts are up, as we do have relatively high uptime on them and they make a massive difference. Make sure to treat the Bloodseekers at the end of this activity with respect, and don't be afraid to play a little bit sneaky with your shrines, saving them along the path behind you just to be able to trigger them when the Bloodseekers are actually spawning in. There's nothing wrong with doing that. The method that wins is the method that wins. It's as simple as that. And that just about does it for today then, everyone. A breakdown of my Barbarian build I've been using to progress the Abattoir of Zir, both easily crushing the early ranks and beginning to progress into the deeper side of things too. And of course the changes that I made to incorporate both the knowledge that we've gained about this activity since it's dropped, and of course also changes made to bring in the Tears of Blood glyph effectively. The only other thing that I really have to say is that this build has the highest potential of any in the game currently. So if you get walled by Abattoir of Zir and you have followed everything that I've mentioned in here to the letter, the only thing you could really possibly be missing to increase your effectiveness a noticeable amount is either uber uniques that you don't have if you don't have all the ones that I mentioned, or levels of the Tears of Blood glyph, which, let's be honest, is the most ridiculous grind in the game, but yes, does increase your damage by about 3% per level gained, even more of course when you get the rare increase bumps, and of course if you can eventually get that radius increase too, that will be an even further massive spike. I hope you've enjoyed this build guide then, and I hope you enjoy using this build for yourself if you try it, and either way, honestly, I wish you the best of luck getting as far as you can within the Abattoir of Zir. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.